Sadie was a very unique person and composer. Today's book is a biography of his life, Strange Mr. Sadie, written by M.T. Anderson and illustrated by Petra Mathers. The biography has a subtitle, Composer of the Absurd. I wonder what makes him and his music so absurd. Any ideas? Let's read Strange Mr. Sadie and find out. Strange Mr. Sadie, composer of the absurd. To my friends at Vermont College, with gratitude and affection. To E.S. Eric Sadie was born by the sea in the village of Honfleur on the coast of France. It was 1866. I was born very young in a very old world, said Sadie once, and he never grew up, but was always a child with an old man's smile. From his earliest years, he loved to play music. He went to a school to learn how to play and compose. Throughout his life, he wanted to make a new kind of music, a kind of music both very young and very old, very bold and very shy, that followed no rules but its own. Sadie's music was like an old chant and wild tunes from kick lines or choruses, but mixed together. Many did not like it. Around him was a world of black top hats and stiff starched collars and gloves and bows and curtsies. It frightened and confused him. People thought he was mad, that his music was bad because it was strange. So, when he was in school, things did not go well. He dropped out, and then in, and then out. He did not go back until he was almost 40. As a young man, he lived in Paris. He began to make friends. One was a poet who worked as a plumber in his spare time. He took Sadie to a famous cafe, the Black Cat, Le Chat Noir, a cafe with grand sweeping staircases and dark wooden chairs, and its very own cat named Maigriot, and the bones of a poet were hidden there, and upstairs was a theater where people put on plays with shadow puppets made of zinc. Le Chat Noir, where all of the poets, the painters, the actors and dancers, the wizards and wisecrackers would sit and sip and scribble ideas or talk about art. Some of these people were painters of clowns. Some were inventors of luminous hats or schemes to cover the ocean with cork so they could travel from France to New York. It was a good place to be. It was like a dream. It was the furthest thing possible from the world of rules and polite smiles and handshakes and spats and bowler hats. Sadie was asked to play the piano at the Black Cat. Here was a chance to play his strange music, his music which sounded like kickline songs and ancient chants, but mixed together. Here was a chance to have people listen. At 22, he wrote his most famous pieces for piano, the Gymnopédies, which he played at the Black Cat while patrons stopped drinking and stared at the smoke, while the cat, who was slinking across the piano, was still. No one could tell as they heard this soft music if it was happy or sad. This music like messages from a child's dream world. They sat without moving at the Black Cat. Finally, Sadie had found friends who would not laugh at his strange ways and tunes. He had found a home. Sadie wrote songs and composed music for puppet shows. He wrote ballets for parties and music for magical spells. Often, he would name his pieces things like the dreamy fish, or maybe in a horse costume. Or sometimes sketches and temptations of a fat man made of wood. He wrote several real flabby preludes for a dog, and a set of 7 pieces called 3 Pieces in the Shape of a Pear. Other composers wrote instructions in their music like fast, or loud, or slowly. Sadie wrote, from the end of the eyes, in the throat, on yellowing velvet, and I want a hat of solid mahogany. One day at the Black Cat, Sadie met an artist and model named Suzanne Valadon and fell in love with her. She already had a boyfriend who was a lawyer, a very rich man. Sadie didn't mind. He invited himself along on their dates. The 3 of them went together, the clever young artist, the penniless musician, and the wealthy young man, who was very, very irritated. When they went to the theater, Sadie hired 2 boys to walk in front of them, banging drums. But Sadie had a temper, a terrible temper, and he would often have tantrums and yell at his friends for making fun of his music, or liking his music, or breaking his umbrella, and sometimes he would never speak to them again. He and Suzanne argued and argued one night in his apartment until finally he threw her right out the window. Luckily, she had been a circus acrobat, so she sailed lightly through the air, landed on her toes, and walked away from Eric Sadie, the strange and obnoxious Eric Sadie, forever. So it went with Eric Sadie. He made friends and lost them in starts and in fits. Eric Sadie walked alone often through the streets of our world like a visitor here. His habits were odd. He wore 7 identical gray velvet suits, and that was all. He did not take baths, but scraped himself with a piece of stone. Sadie was very poor. He had to move into a room so small that to get through the door, he had to climb onto his bed. When he got even poorer, they kicked him out of even this tiny, cold room. He and a friend put all of his belongings in a wheelbarrow and wheeled them through the streets of Paris to another apartment in a different part of town, where he stayed for the rest of his life. He had to cover the windows with paper because the neighbors were always peeking in to see the strange man, the man like a child who lived next door. He lived there alone amidst trash and stacks of paper and a tuneless and tinny piano. Sadie was poor because many people did not like his music. He had dropped out of school, so they said he had not learned the rules of how to compose. He realized he had made a mistake. He needed to know rules so he could break them. In 1905, when he was 39, Sadie went back to school to learn music. He did not complain. He sat at his desk. He patiently did homework and sat with others, those half his age, and he got his degree. When he graduated, he dressed like a man in an office. He always carried an umbrella and wore a bowler hat and looked, people said, like he could not be more normal. And yet, in his eye, there was a childlike twinkle. In 1917, Eric Sadie and his friends put on a ballet called Parade. Sadie wrote the music. The sets and the costumes were built and painted by an artist named Pablo Picasso. The ballet's story was gripping. A circus, a thief, and a girl, a plucky girl with a gun on a bicycle, shooting, all these and more, dancing like a film sped up in a dream. People were used to a ballet being very polite, very graceful, and dainty. This was not that. The music for Parade was funny and mechanical. It sounded like jazz played on xylophones, typewriters, and sirens. Some of the dancers had to wear tall buildings. The audience didn't like Parade at all. They thought it was a joke on them. Maybe it was. They started to yell and to fight. The man who had planned the ballet was attacked by a woman with a hat pin. One critic gave it a very bad review. Sadie was upset. He had a fit. He sent the critic a postcard which said, "Sir, dear friend, you are not only a butt, but a butt without music." This was not a good idea. The critic took Sadie to court. Outside the courtroom, Sadie's friends got in a fight with the police. Sadie came very close to going to jail. Though Sadie got older, he always seemed young. He wrote other ballets, each one an experiment in what music and dancers could do. In 1924, he wrote Cancelled, a ballet with a movie that began with Sadie and the painter Picabia, Francis Picabia, shooting a cannon at the audience, and included a funeral led by a camel. On the music was printed, "When will people get out of the habit of explaining everything?" The hardest thing about making Cancelled, the ballet with a movie, was finding a garage where they could keep the camel. On opening night, the lead dancer was so worried he got sick. He thought people would hate the ballet and think it was strange. He said that he couldn't dance that night. The crowds waited eagerly to get in and see this odd new ballet, but it did not open that night. Traffic was jammed up for blocks. Luckily, the posters already said, "Cancelled." It was not canceled long. It opened a few days later. It had a huge audience. Its sets were made of metal discs. They showed the movie of Sadie and Picabia shooting the cannon. A fireman stood with 2 buckets of water while dancers around him spun and twirled. At the end, no one knew what they had just seen, but they knew that they liked it. And they clapped, and they clapped. Sadie and Picabia drove up on the stage in a small car and spun it in circles, waving and waving until the applause stopped. Shortly afterward, Sadie got sick. He could not stay home with no one to take care of him. So he lay in bed in a hotel room, and the door was attached to him with a string. His friends came. Sometimes he yelled at them. Sometimes he was sorry for things he had done. He was taken to the hospital where the nuns came and went. On the 1st of July, he died. The day of his funeral, poets, musicians, and artists all came to the church near his home to bid him goodbye. In the chapel, a wedding went on while the body was buried. Like his music, it was happy and sad at the same moment, not one or the other. That's the way with his pieces. Sometimes they can sound like night falling and darkness. Sometimes they can sound like him dancing, strange Mr. Sadie, a child man dancing with his umbrella, joyfully spinning and grinning alone.